Hello and thank you for joining me. This video is the first of what will be two, maybe three videos or lessons in which I give some introductory information to the Lord's body of teaching that is commonly known as the Sermon on the Mount. So this body of instruction occurs in Matthew's Gospel in chapters 5, 6, and 7. Now, I'm giving this information in preparation for a study series of videos I'm going to make on the Beatitudes, which occur, I think, in the first 11 verses or so of Matthew chapter 5. And I'm not certain yet. This may develop into just a series of lessons. I may go all the way through the Sermon on the Mount. I'm not sure yet. So there's a lot of information to cover. But I want to begin in this study. So introduction to the Sermon on the Mount, or we have information about, the Lord gives information about the kingdom way. And I want to begin by talking about the name. So this is commonly known, this body of teaching, Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7, commonly known as the Sermon on the Mount. Well, let's talk about the name. And the first thing that I want to call your attention to is that the Bible does not assign a name to this body of teaching, talking about Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7. So, in our time, sermon can create a problem. The name Sermon on the Mount has potential to create misunderstanding about what is the nature of the content of this body of instruction. So how can that be? Well, many understand sermon to be an uninterrupted lecture or oration given by a preacher on a religious subject given to a congregation of hearers. And so in some cases even, and sadly so, a sermon is an act. It is a performance. In common thought, a sermon is not supposed to appeal to listeners' intellectual and reasoning faculties, but rather is to appeal only to people's emotions. So the goal of some preachers is simply to facilitate some kind of an emotional experience for their hearers. When delivering a sermon, it's not uncommon for a preacher to be loud, to speak differently than he normally does, and even to display manufactured emotions at strategic moments. Some preachers assume a different persona. I call it this. Some preachers become another man when they get up to do what they call preaching. Historically, Christians make a distinction between preaching and teaching, but let's understand, let's be perfectly clear. Any preaching so-called that is not Bible teaching, is not Bible instruction, is unbiblical and it is defective. Now, one writer wrote, this is a man named Cleland Boyd McAfee, who 100 years ago or more now, he wrote a good commentary on the Sermon on the Mount. But anyway, this is what he said. I wanted to share this with you. So throughout these studies, I'll be reading some relevant words of other writers. But McAfee wrote, "It is hardly fair to speak of Jesus as a preacher in our modern sense of the word. For the most part, he simply talked. Most that he said was suggested by questions of his disciples or by incidents which were brought to his attention. Much of what he said was said to individuals." I like that. So the point I want to make here as we start out, the Lord's teachings recorded in Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7, these are not a sermon in the common sense in which this term sermon is understood. It would be more appropriate to name this body of instruction something like the King's Manifesto or I prefer the Lord's kingdom instruction on the hill. So I'll be stressing as we go through that Jesus provided instruction. Now, let's talk about the setting and the occasion for this body of teaching. Jesus delivered this instruction early in his great Galilean ministry in the vicinity of the city of Capernaum. The duration of the great Galilean ministry was about 18 months or a year and a half. The Lord did the largest part of his work in Galilee. You say, well, makes more sense that he would have worked it down in Jerusalem. However, Jerusalem was steeped in religious tradition, and the Lord was much hindered from working there. Now, another writer, a man named James Stalker, wrote, in Galilee, Jesus, would be able to address himself to minds that were unsophisticated with the prejudices and supercilious pride of Judea, kind of a big word, I know, where the sacerdotal or the priestly and learned classes had their headquarters. So again, the Lord was hindered. He was hindered from working much around Jerusalem. Now, as a prelude to the teachings of Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7, Matthew gave a synopsis of the Lord's Galilean ministry. I'll read this. This is Matthew chapter 4 and verses 23 through 25. Matthew wrote, and Jesus went about all Galilee, teaching in their synagogues, preaching or declaring or announcing the gospel of the kingdom, and healing all kinds of sickness and all kinds of disease among the people. Then his fame went throughout all Syria, and they brought to him all sick people who were afflicted with various diseases and torments, and those who were demon-possessed, epileptics and paralytics, and he healed them. Great multitudes followed him from Galilee and from Decapolis, Jerusalem, Judea, and beyond the Jordan. So this was a time in his ministry in which Jesus was extremely popular, and great crowds of people flocked to him for various reasons. And we might just make note of the fact that the word crowds or multitudes, the word oklos, the Greek word, it doesn't simply signify a multitude, but rather a confused crowd or throng of people. And so people were drawn to the Lord not so much for spiritual reasons, but they were drawn by the spectacular. They came and they went. People came and went. Some stayed with him a longer time, some a shorter time. Some came to see his miracles, some to hear his teachings. People would straggle away and then they would come back around. And so you kind of had this, and I think this happened a lot in the Lord's ministry. He would have a larger body of disciples, many of them kind of nominal, that they would be gathered to him, or just people who were curious about him. And then there would be a distillation or a shrinking of the crowds. So kind of like this thing going on all the time. Now, chapters we're talking about, we've looked at the name, we're talking about the setting and the occasion of the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7 are set against the background of false expectations about Jesus. So the people who came to him, many of them, they had false expectations about him. They had misconceptions about what he came to do. And the truth is, even his closer disciples, Peter, James, and John, those guys, the apostles, they had misconceptions about what Jesus came to do. So B.H. Carroll wrote, and I like some information that he gives us, but this is what he said, and this will help us. By the way, my study notes are available. for anybody who is interested in having them. I will put an email address in the description of this video, and you can email me, and if you would like copies of my notes, I'll be glad to email those to you in digital format, so just let me know. So B.H. Carroll wrote, the occasion of the Sermon on the Mount was this. He, Jesus, had just selected 12 men, commencing the organization of his movement. These 12 men were to share with him the burden of responsibility and labor, and it was quite important that they should be thoroughly instructed in the first principles of the kingdom which he announced, which that's what the Sermon on the Mount, when we get to it, that's what it is. The first principles of the kingdom. It was equally necessary, Brother Carroll wrote, the larger body of his disciples should understand those fundamental principles, and that the miscellaneous and ever-shifting crowd, drawn together by their expectations of a king, and looking to the establishment of an earthly monarch, which would overturn Roman supremacy and give to Judea the sovereignty of the universe, that this mixed rabble should have their misconceptions concerning the nature of the kingdom of Jesus Christ removed and forever. So as we continue on, we'll see that this instruction, yes, it served the purpose of instruction in first principles, but it was also corrective. Now, continuing, Brother Carroll wrote, the setting or background of the sermon must never be overlooked. The multitudes, incited mainly by desires of relief from physical, temporal, and external woes, even the better informed and more spiritually minded, but dimly recognized the greater spiritual needs. These multitudes constituted the need of these multitudes for correction and getting things lined out straight, getting informed. These constituted the occasion for the Sermon on the Mount. So those are good words. Now, brings me to the recipients of the teaching, and this is as far as I'll go in this video. The recipients of the teaching. Matthew specifically noted, and this is so important. Matthew specifically noted that the Lord addressed the teaching. Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7. He addressed the teaching to his disciples. His disciples. Now, here's the first two verses of Matthew chapter 5. And Jesus, seeing the multitude, so Matthew has given us some background information at the end of chapter 4. And so here, beginning chapter 5, and seeing the multitudes, Jesus went up on a mountain, and when he was seated, his disciples came to him. Then he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, he taught them. Who are we talking about? We are talking about his disciples. Jesus taught them. So Matthew, he made a clear distinction between the multitudes and the Lord's disciples. Now, G. Campbell Morgan, he's probably my favorite Bible interpreter, my favorite commentator. I don't agree with everything. I don't agree with what was his ecclesiology, but he had a sharp mind and he had good insight into the scriptures. So Brother Morgan wrote, seeing the multitudes, he went up in the mountain, leaving the multitudes in the valley. Now, they did not stay there, the multitudes. They followed him, and there's no doubt that they heard a great deal of this manifesto. But he, Jesus, did not address it to them. Speaking of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus did not address it to the crowds. They heard a lot of it, but it was not intended directly for them. It is not for, the manifesto was not for the mixed multitude. It is not for the mixed multitude today. Seeing the multitudes, he went up into the mountain, and when he had sat down, his disciples came unto him, and he opened his mouth and taught them. Okay, so Matthew chapter 5, verses 1 and 2. He taught the disciples, not the multitude. So I'm still reading here, Brother Morgan. Now you ask, do you mean to say Jesus did not intend this enunciation of laws for the multitude? Do you mean to say he left the multitude, abandoned the multitude, had no care for the multitude, and gave his teaching to a handful? Yes. But he left the multitude in order that he might get back to the multitude. So Brother Morgan, he had some good insight. He continues, he left the multitude in order to equip the men who would obey his law, and then show the multitude what that law really meant in life. He left the multitude in order that he might begin the training of that company of men who should return to the multitude and bless the multitude. So I like that. I agree with Brother Morgan. So the Sermon on the Mount, the teaching was addressed directly to the Lord's obedient disciples. It was not addressed to the multitude, but he gave that information in that teaching in that he was training his disciples to be able to take the principles of his kingdom and take it back to the multitude and teach the people. Now, over the course of the lesson, others came near and they listened to the Lord's instruction to his disciples. And we get down to the end, this chapter 7, verse 28-29. And so it was when Jesus had ended these sayings that the people were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them, I think the reference is to his disciples, he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes. So I think based upon Matthew's specificity in chapter 5 and verse 2, I take them to be a reference to the disciples. Now let's talk about this just a little bit. A disciple of Jesus Christ is a spiritually saved individual who is interested in knowing God's word in order that he or she might acceptably serve the Lord. Now, when I was growing up in church, I can't remember ever being directly taught this, but it was at least implied that when you're saved, when you become saved, you become a disciple of Jesus Christ. And, as I got older and I began to actually study, I found that certainly is not true. Now, implied in the description of the disciple of is acceptance of the authority of a significant master, commitment to him and to his way of life, obedience to his instruction. We read in this is John chapter 8, verse 31, relevant scripture. Then Jesus said to those Jews who believed on him, a group of Jews who believed that he was the Messiah, not necessarily were they saved right then. My opinion, my belief, the Lord was talking to people who were already saved, but they came to believe in him, accept him as the Messiah. Jesus said to those Jews who believed on him, if you continue in my word, there's a condition. If you continue in my word, then you are my disciples indeed, or in verity. So again, that's John chapter 8 and verse 31. Now, a man named J. Dwight Pentecost wrote this, has a handy little book about discipleship. And he wrote, there's a vast difference between being saved and being a disciple. Not all men who are saved are disciples, although all who are disciples are saved. This is good stuff. In discussing the question of discipleship, we are not dealing with a man's salvation, a man's eternal salvation. We are dealing with a man, a spiritually saved man's relationship to Jesus Christ as his teacher, his master, and his Lord. Maybe another way to say this, and we'll get to this in a subsequent study. Jesus Christ is the Savior of every believer, but he's not the Lord of the life of every believer, because that lordship involves a decision a child of God makes beyond salvation. So this body of instruction, talking about the Lord's kingdom instruction on the hill or Sermon on the Mount, this body of instruction was not and is not intended for indifferent or uncommitted believers. Now, the spiritual condition of those to whom the Lord provided this instruction determines the nature and content of the instruction. No part of the Lord's teaching of Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7, no part is evangelistic in nature. The plan of salvation is not preached. Eternally saved people do not need to be saved. The need of disciples is instruction on how disciples can acceptably serve the Lord and experience blessings of value and lives of true value. So that's as far as I'm going to be able to go in this video, but just leave you with this. Those to whom Jesus directed this teaching determines the nature and the content of the teaching. So the Sermon on the Mount is not evangelistic. It's not about getting people saved. It's instruction for saved people who are interested in serving the Lord. So I will finish with that. Thank you for joining me. I'll get the next video up shortly, and I hope that you can follow along with me. We have some good things that we're going to be able to look at in these studies. So thank you again. If you have questions or comments, be sure to put these in the comments section of these videos. And the Lord bless you richly, and do take care. Thanks.